What makes a man believe he can outsmart death itself? In 1937, a young man with a flawless plan stopped an old businessman on a lonely Illinois road. Every mile, every letter, every lie, calculated to perfection. He thought intelligence could erase consequence. He thought reason could hide cruelty. He was wrong. Buried in a frozen forest, his secret slept under the earth. But even the most perfect plan can't outlast the one thing he never measured: the human heart. This isn't a story about a kidnapping. It's a story about control, and how the need to control always ends in surrender. The night air over northern Illinois was cold and dry on September 25, 1937. A thin fog clung to the fields beyond the dim glow of Chicago's outer roads. The hum of a large sedan broke the stillness as Charles Sherman Ross, 72 years old and gray-haired from decades of business leadership, drove steadily toward the city. On the seat beside him sat Florence Freyhag, his trusted former secretary and longtime friend. They had driven this route many times before, but that night, something felt different. A car followed behind them, its headlights unwavering and far too bright. The beam flooded the interior of Ross's car, stretching across the polished dashboard, and stayed locked in his rearview mirror for miles. The road ahead was empty. When Ross slowed to let the car pass, it accelerated instead, pulling sharply in front and forcing him to brake. Gravel scattered as both vehicles came to a stop. A man stepped from the other car, moving fast and with a purpose that left no doubt of his intent. The glint of a revolver caught the light. He struck the glass of Ross's door, demanded entry, and motioned with the weapon for the elderly businessman to get out. The quiet, ordinary night shattered in an instant. Ross was taken from his car at gunpoint. Freyhag was left trembling beside the open road, her hands shaking as she tried to collect herself in the echo of the kidnappers' retreating engine. Within hours, Ross's car sat abandoned on the roadside. Police from nearby Franklin Park arrived to find it empty, its engine cooling in the dark. There was no sign of the missing man or the vehicle that had taken him. Calls spread across Cook County, and before midnight, the first inquiries reached federal authorities. The kidnapping of a prominent Chicago businessman stirred unease that stretched beyond the local police. Hundreds of miles north, through the winding backroads of Wisconsin, a second car moved swiftly under the cover of darkness. Inside, Ross sat under guard, pale and exhausted, while the kidnappers pressed on toward Minnesota. Their route ended in a dense patch of forest near the small town of Emily. There, half buried in the cold earth, stood a narrow wooden dugout camouflaged by fallen branches. Its air was heavy and damp, its walls rough with frost. It was to serve as the prisoners' hiding place. Days later, the first ransom letter appeared, mailed from Illinois and bearing Ross's familiar handwriting. It asked for $50,000 and urged secrecy. The envelope's careful phrasing revealed control beyond Ross's will. Soon after, a second letter followed, then a photograph, Ross sitting against a backdrop of birch trees, holding a newspaper dated October 2, 1937. His eyes were sunken, his expression resigned. In Chicago, his family waited in silence. Banks were checked, money prepared, and messages sent as instructed. The ransom scheme was precise and deliberate. Every hour that passed widened the distance between hope and reality, and every new instruction deepened the shadows around the man who had taken him. By the time the first faint light touched the horizon, the kidnappers had crossed into Wisconsin. The countryside unfolded in long, silent stretches of farmland and forest. In the back of the car sat Charles Sherman Ross, his hands bound, his coat drawn tight against the early morning chill. The road wound north through small towns not yet awake. Filling stations stood dark, and the headlights cut across empty intersections that marked the route toward Minnesota. The man behind the wheel, John Henry Seadlund, drove with calm precision. Every turn and every stop had been calculated. His accomplice, James Atwood Gray, dozed restlessly beside him, the pistol never far from reach. The hours pressed on through northern Wisconsin, where the landscape grew denser, the air sharper. Around midday, the car turned off the highway and followed a dirt trail leading deep into the woods. The tires sank slightly into soft earth, leaving deep marks between the birches. At the end of the path, half hidden under fallen branches, was a dugout, just large enough to crawl inside. It was reinforced with planks and smelled of damp soil. This place, buried beneath the pines outside Emily, Minnesota, was where the abductors planned to hold their captive until the ransom arrived. Ross was forced inside. The air within was cold and stale. A small lantern burned weakly, casting narrow shadows against the wooden walls. He was given a blanket and a piece of bread. Gray stood guard at the entrance while Seadlund wrote the first ransom note in a cramped, deliberate hand. It was to be signed by Ross himself to prove authenticity. When the older man refused to demand more than $5,000, Seadlund crossed out the figure and replaced it with $50,000. The letter would travel south that night, dropped in a mailbox before dawn, addressed to one of Ross's business associates. In Chicago, the city began to wake without him. By mid-morning, newspapers had reported only a missing car and an unexplained disappearance. At the Ross home, quiet urgency filled the air. Friends and associates gathered, waiting for contact, while police traced the last known movements of the businessman. The absence stretched through the day, with no sign of where he had gone or who had taken him. In the forest near Emily, night settled early. The lantern flickered against the frost on the walls, the smell of oil thickening the air. Seadlund and Gray spoke quietly outside, planning their next move. They had money to demand, letters to send, and routes to secure before daylight. Inside the dugout, Ross sat motionless, the weight of the cold pressing against him. Beyond the wooden door, the sound of wind through the pines drowned the faint hum of the car cooling outside. In the distance, a lone bird broke the silence. And then, even that sound faded. The world beyond the forest carried on unaware that, buried beneath the frozen ground of Minnesota, the life of a man now depended on the decisions of two criminals in the dark. Days passed in silence across the Ross household, while hundreds of miles away, in the cold stillness of northern Minnesota, the kidnappers crafted their demands. In a small clearing near Emily, smoke from a concealed campfire curled into the gray sky, as Seadlund prepared another ransom note. The first letter had already been sent, its path winding through the postal system toward Chicago. Now, a second message was needed, one that would guide the payment, dictate the method, and maintain the illusion that Ross was alive and safe. Seadlund's tone grew bolder with each word he typed, his fingers moving methodically across the keys of a cheap typewriter bought in a Chicago pawn shop. Inside the dugout, Ross sat against the wall, his body stiff from the cold and his hands trembling. The lantern burned low, the smell of oil thick and suffocating. Each night he listened to the muffled steps above him, the scrape of boots across the frozen ground. He had begun to mark the passing days in his mind, though the hours blurred into one another. Occasionally, Gray brought him bread or water. Sometimes there was only silence. The forest outside offered no sound but the shifting wind through the pines and the distant call of an owl. On September 30, the first ransom letter arrived in Chicago. It bore Ross's own handwriting and carried instructions for a payment of $50,000. The amount startled those who read it, but the tone, calm, direct, unmistakably his, left no doubt of its authenticity. The note instructed that all further communications should go through a trusted associate, and that no law enforcement should be involved. The kidnappers' instructions were elaborate. A motorcycle courier was to drop a bag of cash at a signal, either a gunshot or flashing lights, on a remote highway. Every detail was precise. Every demand was final. In the days that followed, 2 more letters arrived, each more urgent than the last. Proof of life was enclosed. A photograph showing Ross sitting in daylight. A Chicago newspaper dated October 2 spread before him. His eyes, caught in the camera's brief exposure, revealed exhaustion more than fear. The letters were postmarked from Chicago, suggesting the kidnappers had returned south. That misdirection bought them time. The FBI began its early inquiries quietly, coordinating with local police, tracing postmarks, and interviewing witnesses near Franklin Park. Back in Minnesota, the forest had grown colder. The leaves thinned, and frost gathered along the edge of the dugout roof. Seadlund checked his revolver each night before resting, the weapon never far from reach. Gray's nerves were beginning to fray. He complained about the waiting, the food, the isolation. Seadlund ignored him, focusing only on the ransom. The money, when it came, would change everything. In his mind, this was control. Every movement, every word, every delay, planned to the second. He believed himself beyond capture, beyond suspicion. And in the forest silence, surrounded by darkness, that belief hardened into certainty. By early October 1937, tension in Chicago had thickened into a constant weight. Each new letter arrived with deliberate precision, mailed from different corners of the city, each written with mechanical calm. The instructions never changed. Raise $50,000, gather the money in small bills, avoid marked currency, avoid the police. The family complied, following each demand with meticulous care. Inside their home, envelopes and photographs lay spread across a polished table under the dim light of a single lamp. Every line of type, every fold of paper carried the faint pressure of the man still missing. In a rented room near downtown Chicago, Seadlund reviewed his plan. The typewriter sat beside a stack of envelopes, its metal frame dented from use. He typed another message under the alias Albie, directing the route and method of payment. The language was coded, clipped, and deliberate. Proof of life had been established. The next step was collection. Gray waited near the window, restless and uneasy. The two had argued in low voices through the night, their distrust growing with each passing day. On October 8, the ransom exchange was set in motion. The instructions detailed a precise route from Oak Park to Joliet, continuing through a string of small towns westward to Rockford. The chosen courier, a motorcycle rider dressed in white as instructed, carried the leather bag that contained the ransom. He left at 6 in the evening under orders not to stop for any reason except the prearranged signal, a flash of light or the crack of a gunshot. The road ahead was long and mostly empty, cutting through farmland and forest under an overcast sky. Seadlund waited on a rural stretch of Highway 20, 6 miles east of Rockford. His car was parked along the shoulder, its headlights off, its engine quiet. When the distant hum of the motorcycle approached, he reached for the revolver and flicked the lights twice. The courier saw the signal, slowed, and tossed the leather bag onto the gravel shoulder. Without a word, he continued forward, ditching the motorcycle 300 yards farther down the road as instructed. Seadlund stepped out, grabbed the bag, and vanished into the darkness before another engine could be heard. By midnight, the ransom had been secured. Inside the hideout near Emily, Minnesota, Gray waited anxiously, the lantern burning low. When Seadlund arrived, he carried the bag to the corner and unbuckled the straps with trembling hands. The money spilled across the wooden floor, stacks of small bills bound tightly with paper bands. The total was counted and divided. $30,000 for Seadlund, $20,000 for Gray. The silence between them deepened. Outside, the forest lay still, but the air inside the dugout grew heavy with distrust. Neither man spoke of release. Ross sat quietly, unaware that the payment had been made. The forest swallowed the sound of breathing and movement until only the faint crack of branches marked the passing of time. In that quiet, beneath the frozen ground, the crime was complete. The ransom was theirs, and the world above still believed Charles S. Ross was alive. The morning after the ransom exchange, a pale mist hung over the pines of northern Wisconsin. The woods were silent, except for the distant rhythm of dripping water as frost melted from the branches. Inside the dugout, the smell of damp soil and kerosene filled the air. The ransom lay hidden beneath a canvas sheet, counted and divided the night before. John Henry Seadlund moved quietly, packing his revolver and the cash into separate bags. James Atwood Gray sat nearby, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, his face drawn and tense. Between them stood the unspoken realization that their partnership had reached its end. Ross sat on the ground beside the wall, wrapped in a wool blanket, exhausted and weak from hunger. He had stopped asking questions. His breathing was shallow, and his body trembled with each gust of cold air seeping through the gaps in the wooden walls. The men above him argued in low voices. Gray's tone was sharp, impatient. He wanted to leave. He wanted his share, and he wanted to be gone before anyone came looking. Seadlund, always composed and deliberate, insisted on staying until the money was fully concealed. Their argument built quietly until it reached a breaking point neither expected. By mid-afternoon, the two kidnappers began to move their captive to a second hideout, a deeper pit constructed northwest of Spooner, Wisconsin. The new site was isolated, surrounded by thick undergrowth and far from any road. The journey through the woods was slow and cold. The men carried supplies and the ransom in silence. When they reached the second pit, Seadlund lowered the lantern first, then the bags, then Ross. As evening fell, fatigue and suspicion overtook them. Seadlund later told investigators that he believed Gray was reaching for his gun. What followed happened quickly. In the cramped space, a struggle broke out. The revolver fired once, then again. The reports echoed through the trees. Gray collapsed first, his body striking the earthen wall. Ross fell against the wooden planks and did not move. Seadlund stood motionless in the darkness, the acrid smell of gunpowder thick in the air. He checked for signs of life, found none, and reloaded. To be certain, he fired again into Gray's chest, then turned the weapon on Ross. The lantern flame flickered against the low ceiling before dying completely. In the darkness, the sound of the wind returned, faint and hollow. By dusk, the pit had become a grave. Seadlund dragged the bodies side by side, covered them with earth, and layered brush across the surface until the ground appeared undisturbed. When it was done, he stood for several minutes at the edge, listening to the forest settle back into silence. Then he left, carrying the money and the pistol back toward his car parked miles away. The leaves rustled softly beneath his boots as he disappeared into the trees. Behind him, the earth concealed the end of two lives, the victim who had trusted reason, and the accomplice who had trusted greed. The woods of Wisconsin swallowed them both without a trace. 2 days after the killings, the autumn sky over Minnesota turned gray with approaching snow. The dirt roads leading away from Spooner were slick with mud, and the forest carried the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves. John Henry Seadlund drove alone, his revolver resting beside him, the trunk filled with the ransom cash bundled in cloth. The silence of the drive pressed in from every direction. He had no destination beyond distance, only the need to disappear before the first investigators began to connect the ransom letters to the man who had sent them. Hours later, the car came to a stop along Highway 371, north of Walker, Minnesota. To the east of the road lay a patch of thicket where the ground rose gently toward the tree line. Seadlund lifted a small wooden box from the trunk, his typewriter case. Inside it, he placed $32,645, stacked carefully and sealed beneath a layer of cloth. Using the heel of his boot, he dug through the loose earth until the frozen soil resisted. Then, he pressed the case into the ground, covered it with dirt and pine needles, and scattered a few branches over the spot. When finished, he stood still, marking the position with his eyes before turning back toward the car. The forest gave no sound except the faint whisper of wind through the tall grass. The rest of the ransom money remained hidden in smaller bundles inside his clothing and the lining of his bags. He left the woods and drove south through the Midwest, taking long, indirect routes through small towns where he would not be recognized. He bought fuel with ordinary cash and avoided banks entirely. At each stop, he slept in the car, moving again before dawn. The tension that had defined the kidnapping no longer drove him. What replaced it was calculation. His accomplice was gone. His victim was gone. The money, his only witness, had to be dispersed slowly, cautiously, in places where no one would remember his face. By late October, Seadlund reached Omaha, then Denver, and finally Spokane, Washington. In each city, he changed cars, traded names, and tested the ransom bills in small transactions, gas stations, diners, short bets placed at racetracks. The risk excited him. He watched for signs of recognition in the eyes of cashiers, but none came. To strangers, he was another traveler drifting west in the hard years between depression and recovery. His new name was Peter Ander, a quiet man who carried himself with confidence and kept his past hidden beneath clean clothes and silence. Winter closed over the north. Snow buried the dugout at Spooner, covering the graves of Ross and Gray. Ice sealed the ground where the typewriter case lay buried near Walker. For now, the woods held their secrets. No one in Emily, Spooner, or the long miles between knew what had been done there. The crime existed only in the mind of one man driving across the country with a fortune in his possession and a growing certainty that he had outsmarted everyone who had ever hunted him. October faded into November as winter settled heavily across the Midwest. News of Charles S. Ross's disappearance had spread through Chicago and beyond. The local investigation, once hopeful, had hardened into quiet dread. At FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., Director J. Edgar Hoover authorized full federal involvement after it became evident that the victim would not return. What began as a missing person case now shifted into a national manhunt. Across the Bureau's network of field offices, agents received a single list, the serial numbers of every bill used in the $50,000 ransom. Each number was typed and copied, distributed to banks, racetracks, hotels, and law enforcement agencies across the country. The order was simple: trace the money. In Minnesota, winter closed over the forests where Seadlund had buried his past. The ground froze solid, concealing the typewriter case and the pit where the bodies lay. In distant cities, however, fragments of that crime began to surface. A $5 bill appeared in Denver, a 10 in Chicago, another in Spokane. Each matched a number from the ransom list. Field agents tracked them relentlessly, tracing transactions through gas stations, diners, and ticket counters. Witnesses remembered a quiet man with a sharp gaze who rarely spoke. Sometimes he used the name Peter Ander. Sometimes, nothing at all. Seadlund moved constantly. He spent November and December drifting from city to city, from New York to Philadelphia, then south to Miami and New Orleans. He carried the remaining cash in small bundles hidden in his luggage and clothing, exchanging it bit by bit to avoid suspicion. The pattern of his travel, east, south, then west again, formed an erratic map across the United States. He lived alone in rented rooms, kept to himself, and never stayed long enough to be remembered. Yet each small purchase left a trail of evidence. One bill, one transaction, one link at a time. In Washington, the Bureau's analysts began to see the pattern. Each recovered bill was marked on a map, forming a slow arc toward the Pacific. By the first week of January 1938, the latest batch of marked currency had surfaced in Los Angeles. The serial numbers matched those of the Ross ransom. Hoover ordered immediate deployment of agents to California, coordinating directly with the Los Angeles field office. Surveillance began quietly in hotels, bus terminals, and racetracks, places where cash changed hands fast and without record. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Seadlund checked into a modest hotel under another alias. He spent his days at the Santa Anita Racetrack, drawn to the noise and motion, to the illusion of anonymity among the crowd. He placed small bets with the remaining ransom bills, always confident, always watching. The thrill of the risk had become part of his routine. To him, the investigation was distant, something happening to other men in other places. He had outlasted the forest, the ransom, and the winter. He believed himself safe in the sunlit sprawl of California. But as the FBI agents cross-checked serial numbers from the racetrack cashier's windows, the pattern closed around him. What began on a dark Illinois road was now narrowing to a single man standing in line with a racing ticket and a marked bill in his hand. By mid-January 1938, the sky above Los Angeles was clear and pale, the winter sun cutting across the San Gabriel Mountains. At the Santa Anita Racetrack, the crowd pressed against the betting windows as the day's races began. The sound of the loudspeaker mixed with the rattle of coins, the clatter of tickets, and the hum of small talk. Hidden among the spectators, FBI agents waited behind the counters disguised as cashiers. Each had a single task: compare every bill handed across the counter to the serial numbers of the Ross ransom list. It was a precise, exhausting job. In a place where nearly $1 million changed hands daily, only a few notes would carry the story of a man stolen from his car 4 months earlier. Director J. Edgar Hoover had arrived in Los Angeles days earlier to oversee the operation personally. The evidence had pointed unmistakably westward, a steady pattern of ransom bills traced through racetracks, banks, and hotels. Every detail now converged on this spot. The agents moved with methodical calm, their pockets lined with folded slips of numbers and instructions. Over 500 cashiers worked the counters. 500 sets of eyes watched for any bill that matched. At 2:30 in the afternoon on January 14, a man stepped forward to place a bet on the third race. He wore a dark overcoat and carried himself with quiet confidence. The cashier accepted the bill, glanced at it, and in the same motion compared its serial number against the reference slip beneath the counter. The match was immediate. The code phrase passed quietly through the line, and within seconds, the operation closed in. Agents moved from both sides, swift and silent, surrounding the man before the crowd could react. There was no struggle. The suspect was escorted out through a side door, his calm demeanor never breaking. At the Los Angeles field office, he identified himself as Peter Ander. In his pockets and luggage, agents found $14,512, including $5,620 in marked ransom money. A small revolver lay hidden in the lining of his coat. The rest of the money, he claimed, was gambling profit. His expression was steady, his voice measured. Hours passed as agents questioned him, checking each detail against the evidence gathered across the country. When Hoover entered the room, the man's composure shifted. Under the director's questioning, fragments of his story began to collapse. Within days, the full confession emerged, a 28-page statement describing the kidnapping, the ransom, the killings, and the burial of the money. He signed his true name at the bottom, John Henry Seadlund. Outside the office, Los Angeles returned to its ordinary rhythm. The racetrack crowds dispersed, unaware that the last act of a nationwide pursuit had just ended. Across the country, teletypes carried the message that the Ross kidnapping had been solved. The investigation that began on a dark Illinois road now stood complete in a California interrogation room. The final link, sealed by a single marked bill, passed across a betting counter. On January 17, 1938, under a gray Midwestern sky, John Henry Seadlund was flown from Los Angeles to St. Paul, Minnesota. His confession, signed only days before, had already traveled ahead of him by secure wire. 28 pages of meticulous detail describing every stage of the kidnapping and murder. Federal agents received him in handcuffs and heavy winter clothing, the cold cutting across the airfield as they led him to a waiting car. He spoke little during the drive north, watching the frozen landscape pass through the window. Snow blanketed the pines, the roads, and the empty fields he once believed could hide his crimes forever. In the following days, Seadlund guided FBI agents through the final steps of his story. He spoke of the typewriter case buried near Walker, the dugout near Emily, and the deeper pit northwest of Spooner, where the bodies of Charles S. Ross and James Atwood Gray lay beneath the snow. The agents recorded every word, mapping the route with precision. By January 19, the convoy of cars, led by local law enforcement and federal agents, reached Walker. There, after hours of digging through frozen earth, the metal edge of a box emerged. The typewriter case was intact, sealed with cloth, and packed tightly with $32,645 in ransom bills. Each serial number matched the list that had crossed Hoover's desk in Washington. The next morning, the search moved deeper into the woods of Wisconsin. Snow fell steadily as the group followed Seadlund's directions. The sound of horses pulling sleds muffled beneath the trees. The cold stiffened every movement, and daylight began to fade before they reached the final site. At a small clearing surrounded by birch and spruce, Seadlund stopped. Beneath a low mound covered in branches lay the entrance to the dugout. The men cleared the brush, revealing timbers darkened by weather and soil. Inside, the air was heavy and still. Flashlights cut across the walls, illuminating the space that had once held the kidnapped man captive. The floorboards had buckled slightly from frost. As agents dug through the corner of the pit, the first layer of dirt gave way to fabric and bone. The body of James Atwood Gray lay face down, the bullet wounds still visible. Nearby, the remains of Charles Sherman Ross rested where they had fallen. The recovery was slow, deliberate, and silent. Each man was lifted carefully from the earth that had held them since October. Outside, Seadlund stood between two agents, his breath visible in the cold air. He watched without expression as the bodies were carried out beneath the trees. The silence of the forest returned, broken only by the sound of shovels and the creak of frozen snow. When the work ended, the men loaded the evidence and remains into the waiting sleds. Seadlund was returned to custody, the last secret of his crime unearthed. The dugouts, the money, and the graves told the same story he had confessed to in California. One of calculation, greed, and the quiet violence of a man who believed the wilderness could keep his truth buried forever. The train carrying John Henry Seadlund reached Chicago under a low ceiling of winter clouds. Snow clung to the streets outside the Federal Building as marshals escorted him inside. The case had consumed the headlines for weeks. The ransom, the cross-country chase, the confession, the graves uncovered in the frozen North. Now the man who had engineered it all sat in silence as legal proceedings began. Federal prosecutors moved swiftly. The evidence was complete. Ransom letters in his own handwriting, the recovered money, the photographs of Ross alive in captivity, and the bullet casings found beside the bodies. There was no ambiguity left in what had happened. On February 1st, 1938, a grand jury returned an indictment charging Seadlund under the Federal Kidnapping Act. The statute, passed after the Lindbergh case, allowed death if the victim died as a result of abduction. Seadlund listened without visible emotion as the charges were read. His court-appointed counsel entered a plea of not guilty, though the defense offered little hope. The courtroom was filled each day with reporters and spectators drawn to the story of the so-called lone wolf kidnapper. The press painted him as a figure shaped by the Depression years, restless, intelligent, and corrupted by arrogance. Inside the courtroom, the tone was colder. The prosecution laid out its evidence methodically. The timeline from Franklin Park to Emily, the series of ransom letters typed on the recovered machine, and the matching serial numbers on the cash found in his possession. Agents from the FBI testified to the trail of ransom bills traced across the country. Pathologists described the conditions of the recovered bodies, the nature of the gunshot wounds, and the final scene inside the dugout near Spooner. Each statement drove the narrative toward its inevitable conclusion. By February's end, the defense changed its course. Against overwhelming evidence, Seadlund's attorneys advised him to plead guilty in exchange for leniency. He agreed, hoping for life imprisonment. But when the case was submitted to a jury for sentencing, the decision was immediate and unanimous. On March 16, 1938, the jury recommended the death penalty. The presiding judge affirmed the sentence 3 days later, remanding Seadlund to the custody of the United States Marshal to await execution. He showed no outward reaction. Those who observed him noted the absence of remorse, the same calm composure that had marked his arrest and confession. In the months that followed, his attorneys filed appeals, arguing that he had not received a fair hearing and that the statute under which he was convicted was unconstitutional. The appeals moved swiftly through the courts. On June 16, the United States Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the conviction. A formal mandate arrived in July, setting his execution date for July 14, 1938. In the Cook County Jail, Seadlund spent his final days in near silence, reading and keeping to himself. Guards described him as polite, controlled, detached. Outside, the summer heat pressed against the stone walls, while reporters gathered in the street, waiting for the moment the case that had begun on a dark Illinois road would reach its final, quiet end in the electric chair. July 14, 1938, dawned clear and heavy with summer heat. In the Cook County Jail, the corridors were quiet, except for the steady movement of guards changing shifts. Beyond the barred windows, the city stirred as if unaware of the hour approaching. In the narrow cell reserved for condemned prisoners, John Henry Seadlund sat on his cot, reading a small book whose pages were folded and worn. He had been awake since before sunrise. The priests had come and gone, offering prayer and confession. He listened politely but without visible emotion. For weeks he had spoken little, answering questions in short, precise words. His demeanor remained unchanged, calm, restrained, distant. Shortly after midnight, the final preparations began. Reporters gathered outside the building, the hum of their voices mixing with the rattle of typewriters and the shuffle of police boots on the pavement. Inside, federal officials and prison witnesses signed the necessary documents. At the appointed hour, the guards opened the cell door. Seadlund stood, his movements deliberate, as though time had slowed around him. His hair was neatly combed, his suit pressed, his shoes polished. When they fastened the straps around his wrists, he offered no resistance. The corridor leading to the execution chamber was dim, lined with guards who remained silent as he passed. In the next room, the electric chair waited beneath a single overhead light. The air smelled faintly of metal and ozone. The witnesses took their places behind the glass. Seadlund sat without hesitation, his back straight against the wood, The straps were tightened across his chest, arms, and legs. A wet sponge and the copper cap were fitted against his shaved scalp, followed by the black hood. The executioner stood beside the switchboard, his hands steady on the lever. When the signal came, the current surged through the wires. The sound was sharp and brief, echoing across the chamber before fading into silence. At 12:05 a.m., the prison doctor stepped forward and pronounced John Henry Seadlund dead. Outside, the city was still. A light breeze moved through the streets of Chicago as the first morning traffic began. Inside the jail, officials recorded the time, signed the reports, and gave quiet orders to remove the body. The nation's newspapers would carry the story by dawn. The young man from Minnesota, the self-proclaimed architect of the perfect crime, executed at 27. His body was sent north 3 days later, returned to Minnesota to rest beside his father in the small cemetery near Ironton. The case closed with precision, the files cataloged, the evidence sealed, the ransom bills locked away in the Bureau's archives. For the FBI, it marked another milestone in its expanding reach and methodical pursuit of justice. For the families left behind, it remained an echo of loss that no conviction could undo. The road where Ross was taken, the pit where he was buried, and the racetrack where his killer was caught, each carried a silence that endured long after the final act had ended.